My husband said, "You're overreacting again." Then the therapist asked him one question. In therapy, I've learned something that changed everything I thought I knew about marriage problems. Relationships rarely end because of one catastrophic betrayal or one massive fight. They end because of thousands of small silences, tiny dismissals, and moments where someone's pain was labeled as too much. If you've ever been told you're overreacting, this story might unlock something you've been carrying alone for far too long. Before we begin, if this resonates with you, subscribe and share this with someone who needs to hear it, because today we're diving into the moment that changed my entire relationship. The scene was deceptively calm. A Tuesday afternoon in a therapist's office with cream-colored walls and soft lighting that should have felt peaceful, but instead amplified every unspoken tension between us. My husband sat on one end of the couch, I sat on the other, and between us stretched what felt like miles of emotional distance packed into 3 feet of space. The air was thick with everything we'd stopped saying, heavy with conversations we'd learned to avoid, suffocating with the weight of needs we'd both given up expressing. This was our 4th session, and nothing had really changed yet. I'd spent the previous sessions trying to articulate why every disagreement in our marriage felt like walking barefoot on broken glass, why I measured my words so carefully, why I'd developed an exhausting habit of scanning his face for signs of irritation before I spoke. My throat would tighten before asking for anything, my heart would race before bringing up any concern, and I'd rehearsed conversations in my head 100 times before having them. Meanwhile, he sat in these sessions with that familiar posture, arms crossed, jaw set, eyes fixed on some point on the wall, radiating a quiet frustration that made me feel like my very presence was an inconvenience. That day, I'd been trying to explain how lonely I felt in our relationship, how I craved emotional connection beyond logistics and schedules, how I needed empathy when I shared something that hurt me. Before I could finish, he interrupted with words I'd heard so many times they'd worn grooves into my self-esteem. "You're overreacting again." Those 3 words landed like they always did, triggering an immediate cascade of shame, self-doubt, and that familiar question that had haunted me for years. Was I actually too sensitive, too emotional, fundamentally too much for anyone to love properly? But then something happened that would crack our entire dynamic wide open and reveal the architecture of pain we'd been building brick by brick. Our therapist, Dr. Chen, leaned forward slightly, her expression calm, but her eyes sharp with professional insight, and she turned to my husband with a question so simple it seemed almost innocuous. Yet in that moment, neither of us realized this single question would unravel everything we thought we understood about our communication issues, our emotional awareness, and what had really been happening in our marriage all along. Dr. Chen's voice cut through the familiar pattern we'd fallen into, the one where I expressed hurt and he dismissed it, where I reached for connection and he retreated into logic, where my emotions were constantly framed as the problem to be managed rather than messages to be understood. Her question was directed at him, but it stopped us both cold. What would it mean for you if she wasn't overreacting? The room shifted in that instant, the air itself seeming to hold its breath as the question hung between us like a revelation suspended in time, waiting to reshape everything. I watched my husband's face change, the defensive certainty flickering just slightly, replaced by something I hadn't seen in months. Confusion, then the beginning of genuine thought rather than automatic response. His arms stayed crossed, but his shoulders dropped half an inch. His eyes moved from that safe spot on the wall to somewhere in the middle distance where difficult truths live. Dr. Chen didn't rush to fill the silence. She understood that therapy sometimes requires sitting in discomfort long enough for honesty to surface, for patterns to become visible, for people to see what they've been doing without realizing it. For me, that question unlocked a door I didn't know existed, reframing years of interactions in a completely new light. If I wasn't overreacting, then what had actually been happening in all those moments when my feelings were dismissed, minimized, or labeled as excessive? If my emotional responses were proportionate to the situation, then what did that say about how I'd been treated, how my needs had been ignored, how my reality had been constantly questioned? The implications cascaded through my memory like dominoes, touching every fight we'd had. Every time I'd apologized for having feelings, every instance I'd made myself smaller to avoid being too much. My husband finally spoke, his voice carrying a defensive edge that barely concealed something deeper. "I don't know what you mean. She gets upset over things that don't matter, blows situations out of proportion, creates problems where there aren't any. Even as he said it, though, something in his delivery had changed, a hesitation that suggested he was hearing his own words differently now. Dr. Chen nodded, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, and I realized she'd anticipated exactly this response, had expected him to double down before he could break through to something more honest. Dr. Chen's follow-up question came gentle but unflinching. Can you give me a specific example of a time she overreacted and walk me through exactly what happened, including what was happening for you emotionally in that moment? This was the therapeutic technique I'd later understand as slowing down the narrative, forcing us to examine our relationship advice assumptions by zooming into the details we usually gloss over. What happened next would begin the process of dismantling the story we'd both been telling ourselves about our marriage problems and revealing the emotional patterns we'd been acting out unconsciously for years. My husband shifted uncomfortably, clearly not expecting to have to defend his position with specifics, and after a long pause, he offered an example from 2 weeks earlier. She got upset because I was on my phone during dinner, he said, his tone suggesting this proved his point about overreacting, that the triviality of the offense was self-evident. We were just sitting there eating, and I was checking some work emails, and she got emotional about it, said I wasn't present, made it into this whole thing about our relationship. From his perspective, the story was simple. Small infraction, disproportionate reaction, case closed on who had the problem. Dr. Chen turned to me with an invitation rather than a demand. Can you tell me what that moment was like from your experience? I felt my throat tighten the way it always did when I had to defend my right to have feelings. That familiar fear that I'd be labeled dramatic or irrational again. But I pushed through it, explaining that it wasn't about the phone itself, but about what it represented. It was the first dinner we'd shared in 4 days due to conflicting schedules. I'd cooked his favorite meal hoping we could reconnect, and I'd been trying to tell him about something important that had happened at work. As I spoke, I watched recognition flicker across Dr. Chen's face, the kind of professional knowing that comes from having witnessed this exact dynamic countless times in couples therapy. So, you'd been anticipating this time together, had put effort into creating an opportunity for emotional connection, and were attempting to share something meaningful with him, she reflected back, translating my experience into language that highlighted the legitimate relational needs underneath my reaction. Suddenly, in her reframing, my response didn't sound like overreacting at all. It sounded like a reasonable emotional response to feeling dismissed and unseen by someone I loved. My husband's face changed again, this time registering something closer to discomfort than defensiveness, and Dr. Chen gently pressed further. When she began expressing that she felt hurt, what happened inside you? He hesitated, then admitted something I'd never heard him say before. I felt like I'd failed again, like I can't do anything right, and I just wanted her to stop making me feel bad. There it was, the first glimpse beneath his dismissive pattern, the first acknowledgement that his response wasn't about my emotions being wrong, but about his own emotional avoidance, his discomfort with being the cause of someone's pain. Dr. Chen nodded slowly, weaving together both perspectives with the skill of someone who understands that marriage problems rarely have a villain, just two people stuck in patterns that protect them from vulnerability while destroying intimacy. So you felt hurt and disconnected, reaching for empathy and presence, she said to me, then turned to him. And you felt criticized and inadequate, reaching for distance and dismissal as protection. In naming both realities, she revealed how we'd been locked in. A dance where my bid for emotional awareness triggered his shame, which triggered his invalidation, which deepened my hurt, cycling endlessly without either of us understanding the steps we were performing. Dr. Chen leaned back in her chair, creating space for the insight to settle, and began explaining a concept that would fundamentally alter how I understood not just this fight, but years of communication issues in our relationship. Silence isn't peace, she said, her voice carrying the weight of therapeutic wisdom earned through thousands of hours with struggling couples. Sometimes silence is protection, a strategy we develop when we've learned that speaking up leads to pain, dismissal, or conflict we're too exhausted to navigate. I felt tears prick my eyes, because someone was finally putting words to the suffocating reality I'd been living, validating the gradual shutdown I'd been experiencing. She explained that when someone is repeatedly told they're overreacting, a insidious process begins where they start questioning their own emotional reality, doubting their perceptions, minimizing their legitimate needs to avoid being labeled as difficult or too much. Over time, This creates a kind of relational silencing, where one person learns to make themselves smaller, to edit their emotions, to carry hurts privately, rather than risk being dismissed again. The pattern becomes self-reinforcing. The more someone suppresses, the more pressure builds, until eventually, even small triggers can unleash disproportionate responses, which then confirms to the dismissive partner that the person is indeed overreacting, completing a vicious cycle. For my husband, Dr. Chen offered a different but equally important framework. She explained that people who frequently label their partners as overreacting are often dealing with their own emotional dysregulation, specifically an inability to tolerate discomfort, guilt, or the natural messiness of another person's emotional experience. When you say you're overreacting, what you're often really saying is, your emotions are uncomfortable for me, and I need you to stop having them so I can feel better, she explained. It's a defense mechanism against feeling responsible for someone's pain, against the vulnerability required to sit with someone in their hurt without fixing or dismissing it. This distinction between emotional expression and emotional regulation became crucial. My responses weren't necessarily overreactions, but appropriate reactions to feeling chronically unseen and invalidated in my own marriage. Meanwhile, his pattern of dismissal wasn't necessarily malicious, but a learned response to avoid the shame and inadequacy he felt when confronted with evidence that he'd caused hurt. Neither of us was the villain, but we'd created a dynamic where my increasing desperation for empathy met his increasing defensiveness, and the space between us grew wider with each repetition of this painful dance. Dr. Chen introduced us to the concept of bids for connection from relationship research, explaining that throughout any day, partners make small requests for attention, affection, or emotional engagement. When these bids are consistently ignored or dismissed, emotional distance grows, resentment accumulates, and eventually people stop making bids altogether, sliding into the quiet resignation that precedes either infidelity or separation. She asked us to consider how many of my overreactions were actually bids for connection that had been building over days or weeks of being ignored, finally erupting at what seemed like a trivial trigger, but was actually the culmination of accumulated emotional neglect. The room felt different now, charged with a vulnerability that hadn't been present in our previous sessions, as if we'd finally moved past performances of our positions into something more honest and raw. Dr. Chen posed her next question directly to my husband, and I could sense this was the moment she'd been building toward, the intervention that might crack through years of defensive patterns. If we remove the word overreacting from your vocabulary entirely, how would you describe what happens when your wife expresses hurt or disappointment? The question hung in the air like a challenge, forcing him to see his partner's emotions without the dismissive filter he'd been using. My husband struggled visibly, opening his mouth and closing it several times, searching for words that didn't rely on his usual framework of minimization. Finally, he said slowly, "She gets upset, and I feel like I've done something wrong, and I don't know how to fix it, so I guess I try to make it smaller, so it feels more manageable." In that admission, delivered haltingly, was a truth he'd probably never articulated even to himself. His dismissal wasn't about my emotions being invalid, but about his own helplessness, his fear of being inadequate, his desperate need to shrink problems down to a size he felt capable of addressing. Dr. Chen reflected this back with gentle precision. So when you say she's overreacting, what you're actually experiencing is overwhelm at the size of the emotion or need she's expressing, and a fear that you won't be able to meet it or resolve it. He nodded, looking almost relieved to have this internal experience named and validated, to understand that his defensive response had its own emotional logic even as it was damaging our relationship. For the first time, I saw him not as my adversary who refused to understand me, but as someone also struggling, also scared, also feeling inadequate in ways he'd never learned to articulate. But Dr. Chen didn't let the moment become just about understanding him. She pivoted back to the impact, asking him directly, "And when you minimize her emotions to make yourself feel less overwhelmed, what do you think that experience is like for her?" This question demanded empathy, required him to step outside his own emotional experience and genuinely consider mine, to recognize that his coping strategy for his discomfort was creating profound pain for someone he loved. The silence stretched as he processed this, and I could see the beginning of genuine remorse rather than defensive justification. When he finally spoke, His voice had changed, dropped lower, become less defensive and more genuinely troubled. "I guess it makes her feel like I don't care. Like her feelings don't matter. Like she can't trust me with things that hurt her." As he said it, I saw his eyes finally meet mine fully for the first time in the session, and in that gaze was a recognition of damage done, of years of unintentional harm, of a pattern he'd been blind to, but could now suddenly see. Dr. Chen let that acknowledgement sit, understanding that sometimes the most powerful therapeutic work happens in these moments of genuine seeing, when defenses drop and people encounter the real impact of their behavior. Dr. Chen used this moment of openness to go deeper, explaining that patterns like ours don't develop in a vacuum, but emerge from our individual histories, family backgrounds, and early attachment experiences. She asked my husband about his childhood, specifically how emotions were handled in his family, and what I learned in the next 15 minutes recontextualized years of frustration into something more compassionate. He described a household where his mother was what he called very emotional, prone to outbursts that would dominate the family's atmosphere, while his father retreated into stoic silence and taught him implicitly that the best response to emotional intensity was strategic withdrawal. In that environment, my husband had learned that emotional expression was dangerous, overwhelming, and something to be managed or avoided rather than engaged with openly. He'd internalized the belief that strong emotions were inherently excessive, that the person experiencing them was responsible for containing them, and that his job was to remain the calm, logical one who wasn't dragged into drama. This wasn't conscious philosophy, but an adaptive strategy he'd developed as a child to navigate a chaotic emotional landscape, and he'd carried it wholesale into our marriage without ever examining whether it served our relationship or understanding how it would impact someone with different emotional needs. Dr. Chen then turned to me, asking parallel questions about my background and how I'd learned to understand and express emotions in relationships. I described growing up with parents who were emotionally distant, who provided materially but rarely engaged with feelings, who I'd learned to read through subtle cues, because direct emotional communication wasn't part of our family vocabulary. I'd entered adulthood starved for emotional intimacy, attracted to my husband's stability, but unprepared for how his emotional unavailability would trigger my deepest wounds around being seen, valued, and emotionally prioritized by people I loved. The therapeutic insight Dr. Chen offered was that we'd unconsciously recreated our childhood wounds in our marriage. I'd found someone who recapitulated my parents' emotional unavailability, giving me the familiar pain I unconsciously knew how to navigate, while he'd found someone whose emotional expressiveness triggered his childhood overwhelm, allowing him to replay his learned pattern of withdrawal and dismissal. Neither of us had chosen this consciously, but our unexamined histories had shaped our relationship dance, each of us responding to the other through filters installed decades before we'd met, reacting to ghosts from our past rather than the actual person in front of us. Understanding this didn't immediately fix anything, but it shifted the frame from blame to compassion, from "you're doing something wrong to me" to "we're both enacting patterns we learned long ago that no longer serve us." Dr. Chen emphasized that relationship therapy isn't about determining who's right or wrong, but about understanding the system two people have created together, identifying the repetitive patterns that cause suffering, and consciously choosing different responses even when the old patterns feel automatic. This distinction between being driven by unconscious history versus making conscious choices in the present would become central to the work ahead. Over the following sessions, Dr. Chen introduced us to frameworks and tools that gave us language for experiences we'd been having but couldn't articulate, creating a shared vocabulary that allowed us to discuss our relationship dynamics without immediately triggering our defensive patterns. One of the most powerful concepts was the distinction between primary and secondary emotions, the idea that the emotions we express first are often not the deepest ones, but protective responses that shield more vulnerable feelings we're afraid to show. Understanding this distinction would prove transformative for both of us. For me, what often came out as anger or frustration was revealed to be secondary emotions protecting deeper feelings of loneliness, fear of abandonment, and profound sadness about the emotional distance in our marriage. When I'd get upset over small things, I was actually expressing accumulated grief about feeling unseen and unimportant to the person whose opinion of me mattered most. Dr. Chen taught me to slow down my emotional responses and ask myself, what's the vulnerable feeling underneath this reactive one? This practice began revealing layers of hurt I'd been carrying silently, unaware of how much pain I'd been in, because I'd normalized it. For my husband, his dismissiveness was reframed as a secondary emotion, protecting him from primary feelings of inadequacy, shame, and fear that he was failing as a partner. When he said, "You're overreacting," he was actually expressing his own overwhelm and terror that he couldn't meet my needs, that he was fundamentally insufficient, that any acknowledgement of my hurt would confirm his deepest fear about himself. Dr. Chen taught him to pause when he felt the urge to dismiss and ask himself, what am I afraid will happen if I validate her emotion right now? This question began revealing his hidden emotional landscape. Dr. Chen also introduced the concept of repair in relationships, explaining that healthy marriages aren't characterized by an absence of conflict, but by the ability to reconnect after disconnection, to acknowledge harm, and rebuild trust through genuine accountability and changed behavior. She taught us that saying, "I'm sorry you felt that way," isn't actually an apology, because it still locates the problem in the other person's perception rather than in the behavior that caused hurt. Real repair requires acknowledging specific impact. "I'm sorry I dismissed your feelings. That must have made you feel unimportant and alone," followed by genuine curiosity about the other person's experience. We practiced vulnerability exercises where we had to complete prompts like, "When you said X, the story I told myself was Y, and that made me feel Z," which forced us to own our interpretations while sharing our emotional reality. These structured conversations felt awkward and artificial at first, but they created safety by establishing predictable formats that reduced the risk of the conversation spiraling into our usual defensive patterns. Dr. Chen explained that we needed these training wheels while we built new neural pathways, new habits of communication that weren't rooted in our traumatic histories, but in conscious choices about the relationship we wanted to create. About 2 months into therapy, we had a conflict at home that would test everything we'd been learning and mark a genuine turning point in how we related to each other during emotional moments. I'd had a terrible day at work, where I'd been overlooked for a promotion I'd worked toward for months, and I came home needing comfort and emotional support, wanting my husband to help me process the disappointment and injustice I felt. Instead, within 5 minutes of me sharing what happened, he went into problem-solving mode, offering practical advice about updating my resume and networking strategies, when what I actually needed was empathy and validation. I felt the familiar frustration rising, the sense of being misunderstood and emotionally bypassed, and I could feel myself gearing up for our typical fight where I'd accuse him of not caring, and he'd defend himself by pointing to all his helpful suggestions as evidence that he did care. But then, I remembered Dr. Chen's teaching about primary and secondary emotions, and I forced myself to pause, to breathe, to access the vulnerable feeling underneath my reactive anger. Instead of attacking, I said something I'd never managed to say before. "I know you're trying to help, but right now I don't need solutions. I need you to understand how much this hurt, and to sit with me in that hurt." What happened next still makes me emotional when I recall it. My husband also paused, and instead of getting defensive about his intentions being misunderstood, he took a breath and asked, "Can you help me understand what that would look like? I want to give you what you need, but I don't know how." It was the first time he'd acknowledged the limits of his emotional vocabulary without making it my fault. The first time he'd asked for instruction rather than retreating or dismissing. I felt something shift in my chest, a cautious hope that maybe we were actually learning a new way to be with each other. I explained as clearly as I could. "I need you to tell me that this situation is unfair, that I had every right to expect that promotion, that you see how hard I've worked and how disappointing this is. I need you to acknowledge my feelings before trying to fix the problem." It felt vulnerable to state my needs so directly, to risk being told they were unreasonable or too much. But instead of minimizing, he nodded slowly and said, "This is really unfair. You deserve that promotion. You've worked incredibly hard, and I can see how much this hurts you. I'm sorry this happened." Simple words, but they landed like a healing balm on wounds I'd been carrying for years. We sat together on the couch, and for the first time in months, the silence between us wasn't heavy with resentment, but soft with connection. He reached for my hand hesitantly, and I took it, and we stayed like that for a while, not solving anything but just being present with disappointment together. Later that evening, he checked in. Was that what you needed? Did I do it right? And even that question, his willingness to learn, his acknowledgement that emotional connection was a skill he was developing rather than something he should just instinctively know, felt like evidence that our relationship therapy was actually working, that we were building something new together. As our therapy progressed, Dr. Chen introduced a concept that gave name to something I'd been experiencing but couldn't articulate: emotional labor, the invisible work of managing relationships, anticipating needs, processing feelings, and maintaining emotional connection. She explained that in many heterosexual marriages, women disproportionately carry this labor, constantly monitoring the emotional temperature of the relationship, initiating difficult conversations, remembering important dates and details, and doing the cognitive and emotional work of maintaining intimacy while their labor remains unseen and unvalued. I felt tears of recognition because someone was finally acknowledging this exhausting, constant work I'd been doing alone. Dr. Chen asked my husband to estimate what percentage of our relationship's emotional labor he thought he carried versus what I carried. He hesitated, clearly uncomfortable, and guessed maybe 40% him, 60% me. I nearly laughed despite my frustration because from my perspective, the split was more like 10% him, 90% me. Dr. Chen had us make lists of all the emotional and relational tasks that happened in our marriage, who initiated conversations about our relationship, who remembered to check in about each other's day, who noticed when connection was fraying and took action to repair it, who carried the mental load of maintaining intimacy. As we compared lists, my husband's face registered genuine shock at the disparity, seeing in concrete terms how much invisible labor I'd been performing while he'd been oblivious to its existence. He genuinely believed he was contributing equally, because he showed up to therapy, because he occasionally planned date nights when I asked, because he wasn't actively hostile. But Dr. Chen helped him see that not being actively harmful isn't the same as actively contributing, that the absence of negative behavior isn't equivalent to the presence of positive effort, that his passive approach to emotional connection meant I was doing double the work to maintain even basic relationship functionality. Dr. Chen explained that when one partner carries disproportionate emotional labor, resentment builds inevitably, and the over-functioning partner eventually burns out, stops initiating, and withdraws into self-protection. This withdrawal often confuses the under-functioning partner, who experiences it as sudden and inexplicable distance, rather than the predictable consequence of years of one-sided effort. She noted that many of my overreactions were actually eruptions of accumulated resentment about this invisible, unacknowledged labor, moments when the disparity became too much to contain, and I expressed anger about a small trigger, because I couldn't articulate the much larger pattern underneath it. For my husband, this realization was uncomfortable but necessary. He had to confront that his emotional unavailability wasn't just a personality trait or a neutral difference in emotional style, but an inequitable dynamic that placed unfair burden on me while allowing him to remain comfortable and unchallenged. Dr. Chen emphasized that becoming aware of emotional labor is only the first step. The real work involves actively redistributing it, learning skills he'd never developed, and tolerating his own discomfort as he practiced new ways of showing up. She warned us that this transition would be awkward and difficult, that he would make mistakes, and that I would need to resist both doing the work for him and punishing him for not doing it perfectly immediately. One of the most practical tools Dr. Chen gave us was a structured listening exercise that felt artificial at first, but proved remarkably effective at breaking our defensive patterns and rebuilding empathy. The exercise required one person to share their experience for 5 minutes, uninterrupted, while the other person listened without preparing their rebuttal, without defending themselves, without problem solving, just purely receiving the other person's reality with curiosity and openness. Then the listener had to reflect back what they heard, not paraphrasing to make it more palatable, but truly attempting to understand and validate the speaker's experience as they described it. The first time we tried this at home, with me as the speaker sharing my experience of loneliness in our marriage, my husband physically struggled to stay quiet, his face showing the effort it required not to interrupt with justifications or corrections to my narrative. When it was his turn to reflect back what he'd heard, his first attempt was defensive. "So you're saying I'm a terrible husband who never cares about your feelings?" Dr. Chen gently corrected him. explaining that true empathy requires temporarily setting aside his own narrative and self-protection to genuinely enter someone else's experience, even when that experience includes pain he caused. She coached him to try again, and this time he said slowly, carefully, "You feel lonely in our marriage because when you try to share things that matter to you, I often change the subject or start looking at my phone, which makes you feel unimportant and unseen. You've been feeling this way for a long time, and it's been building up, making you wonder if I actually want to know who you are beyond just the logistics of our life together." Hearing my experience reflected back without judgment or defensiveness broke something open in me. I cried not from sadness, but from the profound relief of being genuinely heard and understood. When it was his turn to share and me to listen, I discovered my own defensive patterns, my tendency to interrupt with my counter-perspective, to hear his experience as an attack on me rather than simply his reality, to dismiss his feelings as less valid because I perceived myself as the more injured party in our relationship. Dr. Chen helped me see that empathy isn't a zero-sum game, where understanding his experience means invalidating mine, that we could both have legitimate feelings even when those feelings were in tension, that his experience of feeling constantly criticized and inadequate was as real and painful as my experience of feeling dismissed and alone. Over weeks of practice, these listening exercises began changing how we communicated in unstructured moments, creating new neural pathways where curiosity replaced defensiveness and understanding became the goal rather than winning or being right. We learned that emotional awareness in relationships isn't about perfectly understanding each other all the time, but about maintaining a genuine interest in each other's inner worlds, about approaching conflicts with the assumption that both people's experiences are valid even when they contradict, about prioritizing connection over being right. These shifts were subtle but profound, gradually transforming the emotional climate of our marriage from adversarial to collaborative. Therapy didn't fix our marriage in a straight line of steady improvement. The reality was messier, with genuine breakthroughs, followed by discouraging setbacks where we'd fall back into old patterns and wonder if anything was actually changing. Dr. Chen had warned us this would happen, explaining that neurological change is slow, that we'd been practicing our defensive patterns for years or decades and shouldn't expect to unlearn them in weeks, that the goal wasn't perfection, but increasing the ratio of conscious, healthy responses to unconscious, reactive ones. Still, each setback felt devastating, like evidence that we were fundamentally broken, and all this effort was futile. One particularly difficult regression happened about 4 months into therapy when my husband forgot my birthday. Not just the celebration, but the date itself, working late without even a text acknowledging the day. All my old wounds reopened instantly. The feeling of being unimportant, the belief that I wasn't worth keeping in mind, the suspicion that I cared far more about this relationship than he did. I spiraled into dark thoughts about divorce, about how maybe some patterns were too entrenched to change, about whether I was wasting my time hoping this person could meet my emotional needs when he'd shown me repeatedly that he couldn't or wouldn't. When he came home that night and realized his mistake, his first response was the old pattern, defensive justification about how busy he'd been, how I knew work was stressful right now, subtle implications that I was being unreasonable to make this such a big deal when it was an honest mistake. I felt myself shutting down, that familiar protective numbness that preceded emotional withdrawal. We were standing in our kitchen, and I could feel the familiar dance starting, the pattern we'd done 1,000 times that ended with both of us hurt and distant, and nothing resolved. But then, something different happened. My husband stopped mid-justification, and I could see him remember everything we'd learned in therapy, could watch him consciously override his defensive impulse. He took a breath and said, "I'm doing it again, aren't I? I'm making it about my intentions instead of your experience. I'm sorry. Can I try again?" And then, more vulnerably than I'd ever heard him, "I forgot your birthday and that really hurt you. That's not okay, and my being busy doesn't make it okay. You deserve to feel remembered and special today, and I let you down. I'm sorry." The apology didn't undo the hurt, but it changed everything about how the hurt felt and where we went from there. Instead of spiraling into a 3-day Cold War where we barely spoke, and I nursed my wounds. Alone, we talked. He asked me what I'd wanted for my birthday, and I told him, and we made a plan to celebrate the following weekend. More importantly, he asked me what it brought up for me when he forgot. and I was able to articulate the deeper fear, that I was forgettable, that I didn't matter enough to occupy space in his mind even on significant days. He heard that fear without dismissing it, acknowledged the pattern of times I'd felt deprioritized, and committed to specific changes like setting calendar reminders for important dates and checking in more regularly during busy work periods. As our therapy journey continued, certain themes and lessons emerged that transcended our specific issues and spoke to broader truths about marriage problems, communication issues, and what actually makes relationships work or fail. Perhaps the most fundamental insight was that most relationship conflicts aren't actually about the surface issue being argued about, but about underlying attachment needs, fears, and the meta-message being sent about the person's importance and value in the relationship. Understanding this distinction transformed how we approach disagreements, teaching us to ask, what's the deeper need or fear underneath this conflict, rather than getting stuck arguing about dishes or phones or specific incidents. We learned that empathy isn't a natural talent some people have and others don't, but a skill that can be developed through practice and conscious effort, requiring the ability to temporarily set aside your own narrative to genuinely enter someone else's experience. My husband's empathy deficit wasn't a fixed personality trait, but reflected lack. Relationships rarely end in one explosive moment. They end in the quiet accumulation of unspoken truths, in the gradual withdrawal of presence, in the slow fade of curiosity about each other's inner worlds. They end when we stop asking questions, because we're afraid of the answers, when we stop reaching out because we've forgotten what connection feels like. But here's what I've learned through this journey. The same silence that can destroy a relationship can also be the beginning of its transformation. When we finally acknowledge the quiet, when we name the distance, when we stop pretending everything is fine, that's when real healing becomes possible. The question isn't whether your relationship has gone silent. It's whether you're willing to be the one who speaks first, who reaches out, who dares to be vulnerable again. If your relationship feels like it's drowning in silence right now, I want you to know something important. You're not alone in this struggle, and you're not broken for feeling exhausted. Thousands of couples sit in therapy rooms every week, navigating this same terrain, learning to speak again after years of quiet. What looks like an ending is sometimes just a painful middle, the uncomfortable space between who you were together and who you're becoming. The silence you're experiencing might feel permanent, but it's actually just waiting for someone to be brave enough to break it. And that bravery doesn't require perfect words or flawless communication. It just requires showing up, being honest, and staying present, even when it's uncomfortable. The therapist's question that changed everything for us. What would it mean for you if she wasn't overreacting? Wasn't magical because of its complexity. It was powerful because it invited curiosity, where judgment had been. It asked my husband to consider a reality he'd been avoiding, to sit with the possibility that his dismissal was a defense mechanism rather than an objective truth. And in that consideration, in that moment of openness, something shifted between us. Not instantly, not completely, but enough to create a small opening where connection could begin again. The question taught us that healing doesn't require grand gestures or dramatic declarations. It requires the willingness to see each other differently, to question our own narratives, to make space for perspectives we've been shutting out. Healing doesn't always mean the relationship survives. Sometimes the greatest act of love is recognizing when staying means losing yourself, when silence has revealed incompatibility rather than temporary disconnection. But whether you stay or go, whether you reconnect or release, the work of understanding what happened in the silence matters. It matters because it teaches you about your needs, your patterns, your capacity for vulnerability. It matters because the lessons you learn about communication, about emotional honesty, about the difference between peace and avoidance, these lessons travel with you into whatever comes next. The goal isn't perfection in relationship. It's awareness of what you need to feel seen, heard, and valued. So if you're sitting in that silence right now, wondering if it's too late, wondering if the distance is too great, start with one honest sentence. Start with naming what you're feeling without blame or accusation. Start with asking one genuine question about your partner's inner world. And if you're reading this and realizing that you need support navigating this journey, that you need someone to help translate the silence into understanding, that's not weakness, that's wisdom. Subscribe to this channel for more insights on relationship therapy, communication issues, and building emotional connection. Share this video with someone who might be experiencing their own silent struggle. And remember, relationships rarely end because of one big lie. They end because of thousands of small silences. But they can also heal through one moment of honest speaking. The choice to break the silence starts with you.